In a bid to strengthen ties with the African continent, U.S. President Joe Biden will be meeting with the representatives of dozens of African nations as the second U.S.-Africa Leaders Conference kicks off in Washington, D.C. today. The three-day summit will focus on key challenges, including the climate crisis, governance, food security, as well as how both countries can boost trade and investment. Now, the summit comes as China, which the U.S. views as its rival for global dominance, has consistently outpaced Washington in its investments in Africa. Russia is also trying to rally support on the continent in response to pressure from the U.S. and its allies over the war in Ukraine. But before we bring in our guests, let's start with this soundbite from White House National Secretary Advisor Jake Sullivan.
The U.S. will commit, working closely with Congress, the U.S. will commit $55 billion to Africa over the course of the next 3 years across a wide range of sectors to tackle the core challenges of our time.
Now, Clive Ramathibela Smith, a business and market analyst at Hectare Capital and Partners, joins us to discuss how these talks could play out and whether they could be sufficient to restore the U.S. trade dominance in Africa. Thank you so much, Clive, for joining us on this particular conversation, as it means so much for Africa.
Thank you very much, my brother. It's an absolute pleasure, and I'm greeting all the Africans on the continent and back in Morocco to bring us some pride.
That's nice. Well, I want to believe that you watched that excerpt from Jake Sullivan talking about what the U.S.-Africa summit would mean. And he said that U.S. will be committing about $55 billion to Africa in the course of 3 years as a wide range of sectors are hoping to tackle the core challenges that the entire globe is facing. Now, what do you make of this?
I think that it's been a battle between the West and the East for Africa. We still haven't established our strong ties in terms of who do we really want to trade with. On the other hand, we're trying to be diplomatic, keep the original contract intact so that we can continue to grow our economies. But at the same time, there's been a new span of opportunities that has been introduced by the East, for example, that has created a little bit of a battle between where Africa stands. As you know, earlier this year, we had the Asian summit. Africa was a good representative there. They were there as part of the AU. We had earlier on as well the World Economic Forum. There we were also attracted by the West to say what more can they do to penetrate our markets and how better can we actually solve some of the issues, particularly when it comes to food security and energy crisis that currently South Africa is facing. So yes, the $55 billion, I'm sure anybody would love to have a portion of that, including South Africa. What form does it come with, though? Is it debt? Is it sovereignty? What is it? What are the terms and conditions of applying this $55 billion over the next 3 years? And African countries as a whole have become more cognizant of the realities that the West present as a proposition towards making trade and business actually viable. And so we need to make our independent decisions, working in correlation with the contracts that we have, the companies that we have. And also, we don't want to forget the terrible history that we've had as well with the West. I mean, let's be honest, it hasn't been a very nice relationship from the beginning.
All right. Well, I'm actually glad that you mentioned the issue of power tussle between the West, Europe, Asia within that mix. But then before we begin to talk about what influence they could have, let's quickly look at how this conference would actually influence the dominance of U.S. on the African continent. You've talked about the fact that the relationship has not been that cordial, but then you see a situation where the West is trying to court Africa even as much as Europe is also trying to do the same. Do you think that this would improve the influence or the power or the dominance that America has on Africa? And do you think it will sort of solidify or improve the relationship between these two entities?
I think it's going to be a very difficult summit. I think one of the aspects that you've just mentioned, for example, whether the relationship is cordial or not, when you're courting somebody, I don't know, I'm married. So I remember, though, when you do that in an African context, if you've hurt somebody or if your child has been impregnated before they get married, you need to pay damages for the fact that that child was born out of wedlock. And it's no secret that America has penetrated the African continent, has stripped off some serious resources, have taken advantage better than many of the countries to penetrate our economic system and we've been relying on their system for a very long time, including adoption of the dollar as a currency on the continent. So yes, there are tough discussions to be had. I think different countries will come and different leaders will come with different propositions of how that relationship will work. But let's talk just about South Africa, for example, where we have the trade relations with US-Africa trade. We have DOCPA, which was adopted back during President Obama's time, which has left us with in access of a lot of chicken that is coming from the US that is killing the South African local poultry market. For example, even when it comes to things like pharmaceutical goods and the abstraction of goods that are from natural resources locally here, that has not been utilized. The vaccine story, you would remember that as well. Very challenging to get vaccines. Africa was left out. Fortunately, our African genes are strong enough and we were able to fight the pandemic. But there was serious discussion diplomatically about the access to pharmaceutical agencies, pharmaceutical help when it came to a disaster like the pandemic we just came from. So all these things put a very potent question to each and every one, particularly the leadership of the African continent, to say, what kind of relationship do we want with the US? We've adopted many of the principles, many of the cultures, including the way we rule and control the countries in terms of law, in terms of democracy. But what have they given other than that? That is really tradable and it's viable for us to keep for our people and to sustain relationships going forward. So it's going to be a very difficult commitment to make. If you look at Nigeria, if you look at Kenya, if you look, for example, as well, at the likes of Rwanda and its president and how he's been able to formulate relationships that work for the country, but outside of the US power hold, looking elsewhere in the East, where he's found some successful stories. So it's going to be a very difficult conversation to be had at the US summit.
Well, I'm glad that you're already uncanning the trade situation and the trade relationship that US has with Africa over time, culminating to now. But we understand that Africa has an existing trade deal with the United States called the African Growth and Opportunity Act, which actually gives about 3 dozen of Africans the opportunity to duty-free access to the world's biggest economy, and of course, having access to about 7,000 products thereabouts. Well, we are also aware that this deal will expire in the year 2025, but then there is a follow-up agreement in the works right now, and it will be done and concluded very soon. But then, how do you think these agreements can actually improve, most especially those areas that you've talked about in terms of the trade ecosystem between US and, of course, Africa?
That's a very good question. First and foremost, I think the trade balance has to change and has to shift. There's far more happening on trade from between the US and Africa, but the balance of power, the balance of where that market is, still heavily is on the side of the US. So we haven't been able, as an African continent, to take full advantage of that bilateral agreement that we have with the US. And part of the problem is because the constraints of our countries in terms of trade, particularly when it comes to things such as manufacturing, things such as agriculture, we're still a little bit far back. We still rely on the domestic companies, which are mostly Western companies, which are mostly American companies, to dictate the pricing, for example, of goods and services that need to be exported, to dictate the level of service that we need to be going at, and to dictate the terms and conditions of which that relationship then is standard. And in the minute we are getting an invitation to the table, what is it that we can do to stabilize or to change or to shift the balance so that Africa can also stand a chance to sort of like have a penetration point into the US? The US has to give us more access. The US has to allow us more affordability, more creativity, and we need to create better value chains on the African continent. What do I mean by value chains? We need to have more manufacturing and processing plants here on the African continent so that we can export better products that are ready for consumption, as opposed to taking out the raw material, sending it to the US, and the processing happens there, which creates jobs and creates opportunities there, as opposed to the African continent. Those are the first few things that I think the African leaders must put on top of mind as they go into this summit, is to talk about creating a strong value chain that benefits Africa, that creates jobs, creates opportunities, and also weighs in and makes it better for us as Africans to be able to penetrate the American market.
All right, talking about penetration and, of course, improving the value chain, let's use Kenya as a case study. In July, the U.S. and Kenya signed a particular strategic trade and investment partnership. How do you think this deal worked for Kenya? And if, of course, it shows a positive sign, you believe that rising from the conference and from the summit, it will be like a sort of springboard for Africa to use this kind of prototype, or of course, this kind of prototype to build a very strong and viable investment platform for Africa.
Very good. So that relationship, that Kenya-US relation bilateral, the purpose of it, and it was signed just before the elections, by the way. So what has happened since then is that Kenya has failed to actually take advantage of that. And there's two reasons why. One is the rising inflation of cost and prices that has created a bubble and has made it difficult for the Kenyan manufacturing cars to actually go beyond and succeed in that particular advantage of the contract that they have between the two. So the prices, the high inflation has made it very, very difficult because they can't export as much. And the US, what it does, despite the fact that they've got this relationship, they've got this contract, look for elsewhere to find cheaper available goods, which is unfair. But that's what they did. And then the second thing that has made it very, very challenging is that the US economy has tried to self-rectify by compounding a lot of things internally as opposed to outside, including the things such as your gas, for example, your energy and power. They've tried to create capacity internally, which is making it very difficult, therefore, for anybody else to penetrate the market. And that's what we've experienced. It's not just Kenya. It's not just Nigeria. It's not just South Africa. A number of countries on the African continent find that very difficult. So the question is, how do we do it then? This is an opportunity right now to discuss some of these things at this summit, to say, how do we expose some of the gaps that have been there, that have not made it possible for us to succeed as a manufacturing hub, as a produce of original manufacturing equipment? How can we then access that and make sure that we penetrate the market in the US much easier at a cheaper rate, and we're not actually affected by the trade surpluses or trade costs that are implicated on African countries when they try and enter the market into the US. That's been very fundamentally the problem with a lot of bilateral agreements. Despite that, you have a zero taxing point. The problem is that access to market becomes a difficulty, and therefore African continent is always left outside the box, unfortunately.
Well, I tell you that, Clive, it's going to be big discussions, even as you are unraveling the shades and the sides to what will happen between the U.S. and Africa, even as the summit begins. It's going to be a huge discussion going on right there this particular morning. But then let's also look at South Africa, because we understand that when African countries or when parties come up with their policies in terms of agreements to be signed and all whatnot, each party will be looking for or looking at what will benefit, of course, themselves. A party will definitely, a party will be looking at, okay, if I'm coming to the table and I'm presenting this, how would it benefit me, before you now consider about how it will benefit the other person. All right. Correct. So now, according to what we are hearing, South Africa is set to be running risk of being excluded from any sort of preferential trade deals if its policies are at variance with what American investors are actually open for. Now, how true is this? And can you just shed more light on that, so that, of course, other African countries can take a cue even as they go into talks and this sort of discussions with the U.S.?
I think South Africa has done something quite incredible over the last 2 decades, is to become a very competitive partner globally. We've become part of the global economy very quickly. Unfortunately, the speed at which South Africa moved into these bilateral agreements, into these deals, in these structured, fundamental bilateral arrangements, has been so quick that the country itself has not been able to move together with the government and its policies in terms of the introduction of these new different ways of doing business. Secondly, I think that there's a fundamental flaw, and maybe this is just not for South Africa, but it's also for the rest of the African continent, is to look at the spectrum of which we're talking about access to the other countries. For example, your migration acts, the visa requirements to go in and doing business. It's been so complicated and so difficult. And part of it is because of the risks that South Africa has been sitting on. And you would have heard that there was a warning by the US about terrorism attacks in Sandton, Johannesburg, not so long ago. So all these aspects have made it very, very difficult for South Africa, despite the fact that we are a world leader and we are the second largest economy on the African continent. It's become very difficult to keep up to date with the policy changes because our businesses are not propelled, they're not ready enough to be able to get into those type of structural mechanisms. So that's very sad. But there's a third aspect, and I need to mention it. It's very important. The third aspect is when you make rules and grounds for doing business and trading internationally and domestically for that matter, you need to make sure that you take the entire country with you and lift each and every aspect of that side. So what has happened in South Africa, the high concentration has been with big corporates and not so much at the bottom end with the small, medium enterprises that are struggling right now to get into that penetration. Last point, the way to rectify this particular issue in South Africa is that now we are facing grey listing, which means that we might be looked at financially as a dangerous place to invest, believe it or not, because of the standards that we've set ourselves, becoming a global exemplar. And now we are being beaten by our own enthusiasm to become better because now we don't meet that threshold. We are being looked at now by the rating agencies. We are in junk status at the moment. None of them have moved into the positive yet. And so all these things are risk factors that have put South Africa in a very compromising situation. The last one being our president, as you've mentioned in your news earlier, he's facing now a vote of no confidence. He's got a saga of pala, money being found under the mattress and couches. Okay. So these are problems that Africa face, and it's a challenge.
Definitely. I agree with you totally. It's another kettle of fish that we get to delve into one of those times on the course of the show. But then thank you so much, Clive. I tell you that Africa is just like the bride of continents right now, and this is an opportunity for them to stake their claim and see what they can bring to the table that will bring about socio-economic development, most especially for the continent. But then thank you so much for joining this discourse.
It's an absolute pleasure. Thank you.
All right. Now, according to a press release on the website of the United States government, these summits will demonstrate that America's enduring commitment to Africa is solid and will actually underscore the importance of U.S.-Africa relations and increase cooperation on shared global priorities. It is believed that Africa will shape the future, not just the future of the African people, but of the world. And so the need to strengthen ties with the continent becomes one of the topics that needs to be looked into. And now the onus is on Africa to seek opportunities that benefits it as it helps the world tackle its most urgent challenges. Well, that is the discussion for this morning, but then we still have another discussion coming up after this break. But before we do that, we will bring you international business headlines, and that will be after this.